power is never given freely, and in the case of Agrippina the Younger, it was not inherited, it was seized, crafted with the finest manipulations, and bound by the blood of those who stood in her way. In the year 01 AD, the Roman Empire was at the zenith of its glory, its legions expanding, its trade routes flourishing, and its emperors each more ambitious than the last, shaping history. But even as Rome's streets rang with triumph, a darker tale was unfolding, one rooted not in battles and conquests, but in cunning and control. Her name was Agrippina, born into the turmoil of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, a bloodline forged by both greatness and madness. The empire was her stage, and she was no ordinary player. Though a woman in a patriarchal society, she proved that power didn't belong to those who bore it by blood alone, but to those who could manipulate it, twist it, and wield it like a weapon. Agrippina's reign was not one defined by the sword, but by the strings she pulled behind the scenes, controlling emperors, senators, and even the very fate of Rome. But Agrippina's story is not just one of political ambition, it is a tale of betrayal, of mothers and sons torn apart by ambition, of a woman who went from being the wife of an emperor to becoming the puppet master of an empire. She wasn't just content with the throne, she wanted to control everything, and for a time, she did. Rome may have been an empire built on military might, but it was also an empire that was conquered from the shadows, where the game of power was played in whispered corridors and silent alliances. But how far would Agrippina go to hold on to that power? What lengths would she take to ensure her son, Nero, ruled as emperor and not as a mere figurehead? Let's uncover the secrets of Agrippina's rise to dominance, her ruthless machinations, and her ultimate betrayal. Agrippina's story began not in luxury, but in the shadows of a tumultuous family history. Her father, Germanicus, was the pride of Rome, a military hero whose victories in Germania made him beloved by the people and feared by the Emperor Tiberius. Yet, despite his popularity, Germanicus was a thorn in Tiberius' side, a rival whose growing influence could threaten Tiberius' grip on the throne. In a tragic twist, Germanicus was poisoned, his death a suspicious affair that left Agrippina and her siblings without their protector. For Agrippina, this was the moment when the game of power shifted from a political contest to a personal one. At a young age, Agrippina understood the precarious nature of life in the imperial court. Her father's death, likely orchestrated by Tiberius, left her with a burning sense of injustice and a desire for revenge. This desire wouldn't manifest in rash actions or public rebellion, but in a cold, calculating ambition that would define her life. Despite the tragedy, Agrippina quickly learned the value of connections in Rome's cutthroat political world. She was surrounded by powerful men and women, each with their own hidden agendas. Her mother, Agrippina the Elder, was a formidable presence, an unyielding woman who fought for her children's rights against the emperor. But even her mother's strength couldn't shield them from the machinations of the ruling class. Agrippina's early life was defined by loss, but also by a growing understanding that power in Rome was not about lineage alone, it was about control. Her ambition to climb to the top of the empire began in these early years, not through overt aggression, but through subtle manipulation and the quiet weaving of alliances. Her father's death had opened her eyes to the fragility of even the greatest legacies, and she vowed that no one would ever take power from her again. In 49 AD, Agrippina's path to ultimate power took its first major turn. In an unprecedented move, she married Emperor Claudius, her uncle. Claudius, despite being emperor, was no great figure of strength. He was frail, indecisive, and easily manipulated. For Agrippina, marrying him wasn't about love, it was about ambition. While Claudius may have been emperor, it was Agrippina who truly controlled the empire. Through her marriage, she gained access to the levers of power in Rome, but that wasn't enough for her. She needed more. She needed her son, Nero, to sit on the throne. So, Agrippina, with chilling precision, orchestrated the death of her own husband, Claudius. The emperor, who had been weak and indecisive throughout his reign, was poisoned most likely by his own wife. Claudius' death marked the beginning of Nero's ascent to the throne. Agrippina's plot had succeeded, and in a swift stroke, she placed her son on the throne as the new emperor of Rome. But Agrippina was not satisfied with merely placing her son in power. No, she had another goal in mind: total control over the empire. For the next several years, she ruled Rome not through the emperor, but through her son, directing every decision and every action that came from the throne. For a time, it seemed as though Agrippina had accomplished the impossible. She held the empire in her hands, and her influence was unmatched. Senators, generals, and even the imperial guard bowed to her. But the power she had so carefully crafted began to slip through her fingers, for her son Nero had begun to grow more independent, more reckless, and more dangerous. At first, Nero was little more than a puppet in his mother's hands. He was young, impressionable, and more than willing to defer to his mother's wisdom. Agrippina, through a combination of charm, manipulation, and intelligence, controlled every aspect of Nero's reign. Her influence over the emperor was absolute. He made no significant decision without her approval, but even the most devoted puppet can eventually sever its strings. As Nero grew older, his desire for independence grew. He resented being controlled by his mother, and the more Agrippina tried to assert her authority, the more he longed to rule on his own. It wasn't just a struggle for power, it was a struggle for control over Nero's destiny. Agrippina, who had worked so tirelessly to secure the empire for her son, now found herself facing a new challenge. Her own son, the very person she had fought to place on the throne, was now a rival. The puppet master had become the prey. Nero, once the dutiful son, now wanted to prove that he could rule without his mother's interference. He began to cut the ties that had bound him to Agrippina, replacing her advisors with those who were loyal to him alone. Agrippina, feeling the walls close in, turned to more drastic measures. She began to undermine her son's growing authority. The relationship between mother and son, once so strong, had begun to fracture. But what Agrippina didn't realize was that Nero, now fully aware of the power he held, had begun to see her as an obstacle to his own reign. The puppet was now ready to cut the strings. Nero's rebellion against his mother escalated quickly. Agrippina, once the master of manipulation, now found herself at the mercy of the very man she had placed on the throne. She attempted to regain control, but her efforts were futile. Nero, filled with a growing sense of paranoia and fear, believed that his mother's influence was too great to allow him to rule freely. In 59 AD, Agrippina met her end in the most brutal way imaginable. Nero, in a cold act of betrayal, had her murdered. The woman who had fought so hard to place her son on the throne was now an inconvenient obstacle to his reign. In a plot worthy of Roman intrigue, Nero ordered her death, an act that shocked the empire and left it reeling. Agrippina, once the most powerful woman in Rome, was now nothing more than a victim of her own ambition. Her son, who she had crafted into an emperor, had turned against her in the most vicious of ways. Nero's cruelty didn't end with her death. His reign descended into madness, fueled by the fear and paranoia that Agrippina had set in motion. Agrippina's death, while brutal, was merely the beginning of Nero's descent into madness. The empire, once a symbol of power and order, began to tremble under the weight of Nero's cruelty. After his mother's murder, Nero was no longer bound by her influence. But freedom, it seemed, did not bring him peace. With Agrippina gone, Nero turned his back on those who had helped him rise to power. His paranoia surged, and he began to purge anyone he suspected of being a threat, real or imagined. Senators, generals, and even his closest allies fell victim to his distrust. His reign became one of terror as he turned Rome into a city of fear. In his frantic need to secure his position, Nero cast aside all pretense of virtue. His excesses knew no bounds. While Rome burned in a literal and figurative sense, Nero held lavish feasts, indulgences, and spectacles that further alienated him from the people. The empire, once so powerful, now teetered on the brink of collapse. What Agrippina had built an empire controlled by cunning, manipulation, and careful alliances was now crumbling under Nero's rule. But Agrippina's legacy wasn't just the rise of her son, it was the chaos that followed. Her ambition had planted the seeds for Rome's internal destruction, and it was her manipulations that gave birth to a ruler incapable of managing the empire his mother had so carefully crafted. Nero's cruel reign was a direct result of the power struggle Agrippina set in motion. Her control had enabled him, but it had also weakened him. Without his mother's guidance, he became a puppet of his own emotions, fear, paranoia, and a hunger for power that was insatiable. In the end, Nero's madness wasn't just a product of his own psyche. It was the final consequence of Agrippina's deadly ambition. But while Agrippina's death had set Nero free, it also set the stage for his ultimate destruction. The once great emperor was now a symbol of corruption, greed, and betrayal. His reign spiraled out of control. The Senate, once his ally, turned against him. The people of Rome, who had once adored him, now saw him as a tyrant. Nero's public persona was shattered by scandal, cruelty, and incompetence. The Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD was a turning point, a symbol of Nero's failures as emperor. Rumors spread that Nero himself had ordered the fire to clear space for his extravagant palace, the Domus Aurea. The flames consumed much of Rome, and the people, already weary of his excesses, now saw Nero as a man willing to destroy his own city for his own gain. In the wake of the fire, Nero attempted to shift blame. He scapegoated the Christians, leading to their brutal persecution. Yet, as much as he tried to divert attention from his own failures, the damage had been done. Rome was a city in ruins both physically and politically. As Nero's paranoia deepened, his grip on power loosened. He was no longer seen as a ruler, but as a madman who would do anything to cling to power. His old allies turned against him, and even his closest generals began to question his ability to lead. In 68 AD, the Senate finally declared him a public enemy. Nero fled from the palace, a man on the run. With no army, no support, and no options left, he ultimately took his own life by his own hand. The last of the Julio-Claudian emperors was gone, and Rome was left to pick up the pieces of an empire destroyed by internal strife and ambition. Nero's death was the end of an era. But even in his downfall, his actions were a reflection of Agrippina's legacy. His excesses, his cruelty, and his fear were all rooted in the empire that his mother had crafted, a world where manipulation, betrayal, and control were the only currencies that mattered. In the end, Agrippina's name was erased from the annals of history. Claudius ordered that her statues be torn down, her name struck from official records. But no amount of erasure could remove the truth of her legacy. Agrippina was a woman who played the game of power like few others, and though she may have been silenced, her influence lived on long after her death. Rome's greatest leaders were not just those who conquered foreign lands, but those who knew how to manipulate the people around them, those who understood that power was not just about armies, but about controlling the very hearts of those in power. Agrippina understood this better than anyone. She may have been removed from the official history books, but the empire she helped shape and the legacy she left behind cannot be erased. Her ambition, her ability to control those around her, and her determination to hold power at any cost reshaped the very fabric of the empire. Without Agrippina, there would have been no Nero, no fire, no persecution of Christians. There would have been no collapse of the Julio-Claudian dynasty and the way it unfolded. And so, Agrippina's story remains a haunting reminder of what happens when power is sought at any cost. Her manipulation, her ambition, and her willingness to sacrifice everything for control left a mark on Rome that could never be erased. Even in death, Agrippina remains one of the most influential figures in the history of the Roman Empire. She taught us that in the game of power, there are no boundaries and no price too high to pay. Agrippina's story may have ended in betrayal and madness, but Rome was far from done with corruption and ambition. In our next episode, we explore another ruler whose manipulative ways changed the course of history, a ruler whose legacy was shaped by violence, sex, and a thirst for absolute power. Stay tuned to uncover the next chapter in Rome's dark history. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Agrippina's ruthless reign, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. What do you think of Agrippina's legacy? Was she the mastermind behind Rome's most infamous emperor, or a victim of ambition? Let us know your thoughts below.